Rising housing costs have made many US cities unaffordable and made homeownership unattainable. There are plenty of videos on the housing crisis, but what this one tries to do is put the housing affordability crisis in historical perspective and help us understand, frankly, how we got ourselves into this mess. There's a whole lot to cover, and even with a video this long, I'm gonna need to leave a ton out. And I need to set some parameters. We're gonna start 100 years ago to really understand the scope of history with regards to housing. We also need to set a limit on the causes of the housing crisis to the few big ones. I wanna focus on 3 for this video. First is supply. When there are lots of homes available, prices are affordable. When homes are scarce, prices rise. So we're gonna look at why housing is scarce now, particularly relative to past eras. Second is financing. This is a big overlooked reason for why homes might be unaffordable. High interest rates can make mortgage payments balloon and put homeownership out of reach. Financing, in this video at least, also means the financialization of housing, where housing is seen as an investment first and a place to live second. Finally is policy. While supply looks at housing production, policy is all about the ways policy can encourage or discourage the production from a regulatory perspective. This is where we also talk about NIMBYs, or not in my backyard activists. They actively try to use local and state policy to curtail new housing construction, at least in their backyards. So let's travel back to 1925 after the bike bell. What was the housing supply situation like back then in 1925? Well, it was basically the complete opposite of what it's like today. We were in the peak of a housing boom. Prior to 1925, most housing booms were regional as new cities sprung up in the expanding United States. But in 1925, housing was being built in, or should I say around, just about every city. The reason was simple: the car. Over half of US households had access to the car by this point, and this opened up vast amounts of real estate around cities for new housing construction. Prior to this, houses could only be built within walking distance of a streetcar stop along streetcar lines. Now, houses could be built just about anywhere you could get a road to. These new houses were also built in a market that increasingly demanded better housing. This resulted in policy changes. The state of New York passed the Tenement Housing Act in 1901, which banned the construction of apartment buildings with poor ventilation and no indoor plumbing. Every room needed a window. But in 1925, there's still plenty of poorly constructed housing units throughout the country, and urban density was extremely high. The prospect of a nice home out in the suburbs was a strong draw for many people. This demand was coupled with lenders boosting the supply of credit to home builders and prospective buyers. Prior to the 1920s, a majority of Americans didn't own their own homes at all. Only about 45 to 48% did. In urban areas, just about everyone were renters, sometimes in the aforementioned tenements. Banks began to loan money to people to buy homes in greater numbers to help propel this new housing boom. The home loans back then did not resemble today's 30-year fixed-rate mortgages. Loans in the 1920s were short, often 5 years, variable rate, and required a 50% down payment. There was typically a large balloon payment due at the end of the loan's term as well. So what occurred about 5 years after 1925, about the time when all those balloon payments came due? Oh yeah, the stock market crash. Scholars actually argue about how much the housing boom's bust contributed to the 1929 stock market crash and subsequent Great Depression, but the parallels to the Great Recession in this millennium are definitely there. In general, though, the main takeaway of this era is that ample land with few neighbors, NIMBYs, low regulations, and access to credit allowed for a lot of housing to be built quickly. I didn't really get too deep into the regulation side, save for tenement laws, but prior to 1925, there weren't many cities with comprehensive zoning codes, at least not the kind we'd recognize today. That's because cities weren't sure about the constitutionality of zoning. Could a city regulate how a person could use their land, or would that be considered a taking under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution? In 1926, the US Supreme Court decided the case of the Village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty Company. They broadly found that zoning codes did not violate the takings clause and cities could zone as they wished. The federal government saw the benefits of community zoning and reissued a Standard Zoning Enabling Act the same year. The acts were adopted by state legislatures to give cities the powers to zone. Why is zoning bad when it comes to housing? Well, zoning is about more than just separating incompatible uses. It includes development standards that dictate lot size, building heights, lot coverage, and that sort of thing. It can specify that single-family homes are the only kind of housing that can be built. In the 1920s, when land was plentiful, this may not have seemed like a big deal. But today, zoning is seen as more restrictive, but we'll get to that. Now, the impact of zoning wouldn't be seen for another couple of decades because the nation was thrown into the Great Depression, a time when banks were simply not loaning money to home builders or home buyers. With the private sector stalled out, the public sector stepped in. The Federal Housing Administration began guaranteeing loans for new construction of neighborhoods so long as they were suburban-style single-family homes. At the same time, there was a great push for public housing. Led by the intrepid housing advocate Catherine Bauer, Congress passed the Housing Act of 1937, which allowed local housing agencies to begin building public housing. If Bauer had gotten her way on the entire bill, the United States may have had a robust social housing program that would provide affordable housing to this day. It's one of those great what-ifs in the world of planning. Bauer's bill, while still progressive, was handicapped by amendments that she personally disapproved of. This included a focus on building housing in deteriorating neighborhoods through slum clearance instead of on vacant land. The bill also required clearing one dilapidated slum home for every new public housing home built. Essentially, the bill forced public housing to be about improving the quality of housing on average instead of increasing the overall amount. It also capped the income of people who could move into that new housing, making it a policy for the very poor instead of for everyone. Finally, the budget per unit was so low that the new housing would never be of very high quality. We'll pick up the story of public housing more in the next era, but for now, what's important to know is that there was a robust debate happening about the point of public housing. Is it for slum clearance and upgrading, or for providing affordable housing for all? Okay, up until this point, it's all been preamble. We've really been setting the scene for the next big epoch, the post-war years. Let's start by talking about housing supply first. When service members returned from World War II, they found that they were not able to find housing as homebuilders didn't build much in the Great Depression or during the war. And just as we talked about, public housing wasn't generating new units, just replacing dilapidated ones. So these GIs did something we associate with millennials and Gen Z. They moved back in with their mom and dad. Almost a quarter of households during this period were multi-generational, a sign that there wasn't enough housing for everyone who needed it. Today that number is 18%, but it has been increasing steadily since 1971, when the rate was only 7%. All of this pent-up demand for housing meant that there was an opportunity to build housing at a large scale, and that's exactly what homebuilder William Levitt did. He built two Levitt towns, one on Long Island and the other near Philadelphia. Houses were built by the thousands and built affordably. A new house cost just over $100,000 in today's dollars. Perhaps more importantly, it revolutionized housing construction, turning it into an assembly line. Copycats across the country started building neighborhoods full of affordable single-family homes for returning GIs. To understand the scope of this change in new housing construction, let's look at this graph. You can see the housing construction ebb and flow before World War II. And look what happened afterward. It's like night and day. It's like an entire industry flicked on a light switch and learned how to build affordable suburban housing. The overall trend remained constant for the next 50 years. We know that this new housing is cheap, but most families still required financing. The financing in the 1920s was primarily those 5-year loans that had a balloon payment at the end, but during the Depression, the federal government stepped in and the Federal Housing Administration started guaranteeing loans, protecting banks against defaults. They started at 5 years, but began guaranteeing loans with longer lifespans. 5 years became 15, then 20, then 25, and finally 30. 30-year mortgages make for smaller monthly payments, which puts homeownership within reach for more people. You can see the effect more housing and better financing had on homeownership rates. They skyrocketed from about 43% of households owning a home to 65% by the 1960s. At the same time, the US Federal Reserve had established low interest rates, making it easier to obtain that loan and become a homeowner. What about housing policy? I alluded to the fact that zoning codes can restrict housing production, but in this era, the limitation was minor compared to the rapid construction of new housing. It was a story similar to the 1920s, actually. Instead of streetcars, it was highways opening up vast areas for new residential development. Cars can move fast on highways and new suburban arterials, meaning that people can live in towns miles and miles away from where they work. Cheap greenfield development overrode any policies that could slow down Levittown-style mass manufacturing of homes. I want to round out this era by talking about something that's both policy and supply, but I'm going to put it into supply for now. It's time to talk about public housing again. Like I mentioned before, the debate was about slum clearance versus affordable housing. The Housing Act of 1949 clearly favored slum clearance and allowed cities to clear slums and sell the land to private real estate developers to build housing according to the city's plan. The Housing Act of 1954 introduced the term urban renewal, which we now associate with the widespread demolition of older neighborhoods for tall, sterile public housing blocks, as well as universities, hospitals, convention centers, and stadiums in downtown areas. US public housing policy did little to actually increase the supply of housing and largely concentrated poverty. Funding to maintain the public housing was never enough, and the entire program soured the public's taste for social housing programs. Now let's move on to the next era, the 1970s through the bubble bursting in 2008. Scholars point to 1970 as an inflection point in housing because it's when the housing market starts to change. Prior to 1970, the market behaved kind of normally. If housing prices started increasing, it implied that there was demand for more housing and housing construction increased. Housing prices were roughly proportional to how much the housing cost to build, but after 1970, prices started to rise a little faster than you'd expect, indicating that there might be some other variables affecting the price. One of these effects is NIMBYism. NIMBYism in the 1970s began as exclusionary policies designed to keep low-income and minority homebuyers from moving into their neighborhoods. In 1968, the federal government passed the Fair Housing Act, which outlawed explicit discrimination around housing, but NIMBYs at the time figured out that they could oppose multifamily housing and enact zoning regulations that made it impossible to build anything but upper-income homes available primarily to white residents. This is where we see some communities adopting minimum lot sizes of an acre, meaning only large houses spaced far apart could be built. I'm not saying that all zoning changes in this era were exclusionary by design, but the general trend toward increasing housing costs was there, and exclusion did play a role. It further reinforced the idea that suburbs were not meant to be dense like inner cities, but more spread out and more expensive. There wasn't a housing crisis yet, unless you were a person of color. Then it was a crisis of affordability and access, and Black households were still unable to tap into the American dream in large numbers and build that home equity. Speaking of which, we started to see a change in how people saw their house during this time period. Prior to this era, people typically bought a house by taking out a mortgage, paying off that mortgage, and staying in the house until they died. Housing wasn't really seen as a major financial asset. There were financial incentives to owning a home, but the house was primarily seen as just a home. In the 1970s and 1980s, we saw a trend towards financialization. That term basically means treating something that is not a traditional financial asset as a financial asset. This happened for a few reasons. First, in this era, people started moving more than they did before, perhaps to do something like find a new job. Selling a house and buying a new one became more commonplace. People also lived longer than ever before, so retiring and selling your house to buy a condo in Florida or Arizona or wherever became more common. Second, people began to pay more attention to the value of their house. When you start paying attention to property values, you start wanting to ensure that your property values continue to go up. This again feeds into the NIMBY mindset, where property values become so important that you want to move into an HOA to preserve them or become against any possible change that could pose a real or perceived risk to your property values. This all started in this era. Financialization also attracted investors and Wall Street. This actually technically began in the last era when the federal government allowed for the establishment of something called real estate investment trusts, or REITs, back in 1960. But they really grew in this era as REITs became corporations that bought and sold residential and commercial properties in large numbers. We'll talk more about corporate investors more in the next era, but just be aware that they're growing in influence right now. Let's touch on housing supply in this era before we move on into the modern era. Here's the chart for new home starts from 1960 to the present. You can see that this era had some of the largest spikes of new home construction. A lot of this is due to the baby boomers. The kids born to GIs after the war are now old enough to buy homes for themselves, and housing construction largely met that need. Housing production peaked in 1972, but remained strong despite some intermittent recessions. Okay, now we're moving to the modern era. This era begins with a bang, or really with a crash. The subprime mortgage crisis and subsequent Great Recession disrupted the housing market. Subprime mortgages burst the housing bubble, resulting in foreclosures, and the cascading effects tanked the market. The movie The Big Short chronicles this era if you're interested. This is a direct result of financialization of the housing market, where mortgages were seen by banks as tradable securities. Once the bubble burst, people lost their homes to foreclosure and banks lost a lot of money. Also, nearly all the capital required to build more housing disappeared as well, and housing construction stalled. Stalled housing construction is a problem because in many areas of the country, housing construction had not kept up with household formation. Household formation comes from population growth or from households becoming smaller. The average household size in 1950 was about 3.5, while today it's 2.5. That's fewer people in each home, meaning there needs to be more homes to accommodate everyone. So we've got more households, but despite all of the building in the previous era, there just isn't enough housing where people want to live. This housing affordability crisis wouldn't be so bad if wages were keeping up with prices, but they haven't. We know this due to a metric called cost burden. If a household is cost burdened, it's paying more than 30% of its income on housing costs. In general, you want to be paying less than that. Some households are severely cost burdened, which means that they're paying more than 50% of their income on housing. You can see in this graph of renters how the proportion of cost burdened renter households has increased over time. This is not good. There are concerns that rising rents for renters are coming because of an increase in institutional landlords. Basically, those REITs I talked about earlier buying up homes in single-family neighborhoods and renting them out, eager to squeeze every last dime out of the households living there. They also increase housing costs for buyers as they compete for those houses on the open market. The reality is that these corporate landlords typically enter a market after rents have increased, taking advantage of the higher rents they can charge at market rate. These corporations are looking for markets with high population growth, but low but increasing housing costs. Places like New York, Seattle, and California, where the housing crisis is the worst, actually doesn't fit the bill. Corporate landlords may be helping to spread the housing affordability crisis, but even still, the homes they own only make up a small percentage of total homes. They only deserve a small share of the blame. Before we close out this era, we need to talk about the NIMBYs. In the previous era, many NIMBY concerns focused on systemic exclusion, while in this era it's mostly about preserving property values and preserving existing quality of life. When scholars think about modern NIMBYism, it's mostly around this split between the diffuse benefits and concentrated costs of certain projects. For example, there are region-wide benefits to building a multifamily affordable housing development, but there are local traffic and noise costs associated with having a larger building like that built nearby. Local NIMBYs organize to stop it, and the region doesn't get the benefit of that housing. NIMBYs are also just advocating for themselves selfishly, but there are no real advocates for those people who would have moved into that building, because they're only hypothetical until they move in. This makes the NIMBY position quite powerful, as there are no default opponents. Therefore, NIMBYs can restrict supply by using local laws, the community engagement process for local planning efforts, and local media to oppose projects that may be negatively impacting their quality of life or property taxes, even if the city or region desperately needs the project. This is why suburban development in the previous two eras worked so well. There were no opponents out in the greenfields to oppose them. Today, we're seeing a renewed interest in urban living coupled with a realization that you can't keep building out forever. Eventually, the commutes get too long and traffic gets too bad. This is all a recipe for less housing being built than ever before. So what's going to happen in the next era? Well, it's hard to say. We're in an era of profound uncertainty. Here's what I think could happen in each of our three lines. On the supply side, home builders are getting better at building small lot single-family homes that can better take advantage of smaller parcels and urban infill areas. So-called missing middle housing is becoming a little less missing, and I expect there to be more of it built. It just matches the market better than single-family homes now that we have smaller household sizes. I don't have a lot of hope for construction of new public housing in the US, but I've been hearing for more calls for it. If we get a progressive federal administration in the next decade or two, I hope that there's a push for the government to build or incentivize new housing that is desperately needed. With regard to financing, I'm not hopeful things are going to get better or easier. We live in a society, for better or for worse, where you can know exactly how much each home in your neighborhood is worth, thanks to websites like Redfin and Zillow. It's also easier than ever to extract wealth from your home via a home equity loan. People will continue to see their houses as investments and not just homes. On the policy side, I am heartened by the NIMBY movement's successes in driving new policies to build more homes. NIMBYs seem like they're on the retreat in some areas. This has resulted in some innovative legislation to unlock new housing. I already did a video on accessory dwelling units, which could bring some density to the suburbs. Here in California, there are also laws to make it easier to build university housing, housing on parcels with a religious use, and housing on parcels zoned for big box commercial. The housing crisis is one of the biggest challenges facing cities, and if you made it this far, maybe you'd like to do something about it yourself. And one of the best ways to do that is to get a degree. It can be tough to go to school or go back to school, but Eastern Washington University's accredited programs in Bachelor of Arts in Urban and Regional Planning and Master of Urban and Regional Planning programs make it really, really easy. They offer evening classes designed for working professionals, and you can apply on your schedule. They have rolling admissions, and you can start in the fall or the spring semester. Eastern Washington's programs are located in Spokane, Washington, in the beautiful heart of the interior Northwest. I love small cities like Spokane because they're accessible to planning students with new ideas. They're not big cities with huge bureaucracies. And Spokane gives students the best of both worlds. It's on the West Coast, meaning it's going to be testing some of the most progressive planning ideas in the US. But it's also way more affordable to live in Spokane than most places on the West Coast. And that's no small thing. The city of Spokane recently removed minimum parking requirements and changed their zoning to allow for up to 6 units on most residential lots. Those are ideas far ahead of most cities in the country. Eastern Washington students get to continue to push the status quo and evaluate the consequences of these policies. They do that through real-world projects. Spokane is the program's living laboratory. After you graduate, you'll want a job in the field to put all of that knowledge to use. Eastern Washington students have an excellent track record finding jobs in the field. It's one of their hallmarks as a program. So if you want to transform your passion for cities into professional impact, consider Eastern Washington's Bachelor of Arts in Urban and Regional Planning or Master of Urban and Regional Planning programs, where emerging planners become city shapers in the heart of the Inland Northwest's urban laboratory. Go click on the link on screen or in the description to learn more and apply now.